firestorm ignited on Twitter yesterday. Imagine that. Over the New York Times media columnist Ben Smith's latest piece. It analyzes Ronan Farrow's investigative reporting and the whole idea of resistance journalism.
So a friend of the show, Intercept's DC bureau chief Ryan Grim, he remarked that there are legit criticisms to make about Ben's story, but make those criticisms rather than trying to divine some nefarious motivation. And the Intercept's DC bureau chief Ryan Grim joins us now to talk more about that. Good to see you, Ryan.
Good to see you guys.
Absolutely. So, Ryan, I immediately saw kind of like a Neera Tanden and other crowd kind of pile on to Ben Smith's profile of Ronan and kind of, I guess you could call it a takedown, or it's at least a criticism of some of his past reporting, basically around some of the Weinstein stories, but more specifically, I think, some Russiagate-esque stuff that just didn't end up to be true. Why is it that you think that not going after Ronan, but writing a story about Ronan was met with such, like, people were so agog and aghast by it, people like Neera Tanden? What describes that?
Well, I think it's fair to call it going after. I bet Ben would be okay with that. Ronan has kind of been sainted by the journalistic community for the work that he's done over the last couple of years. Particularly when it comes to Me Too. That's obviously where he's made his name, and the number of people, high profile people that he has taken down is without precedent. In you'd have to go back to Woodward and Bernstein taking down the president to have to find another journalist who has had that much of an impact. And and Glenn Greenwald at the Intercept laid out in a couple of paragraphs other reasons culturally and politically why he's been given this halo by the community. So it's genuinely brave to come after somebody who has that much popularity, even if I do think he's swung and missed on a couple of pieces here and there.
So, Ryan, one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you about this is because it seemed like you had a nuanced view of Ben's column, parts that you thought were fair, parts that you thought missed the mark. Just talk a little bit about that.
And so I think you can break Ben's column down into two distinct themes. One is what he called resistance journalism, which he described as this kind of new trend over the last 3 years or so, when if you're doing reporting that is essentially anti-Trump, but what he described as ably swimming along the tide of social media, then you're going to be rewarded and incentivized along the way. And mistakes that you make or falsehoods that you perpetuate are going to be glossed over and forgiven, and in some cases even rewarded. And Glenn Greenwald, writing at the Intercept, focused a lot on that part of Ben's column in praising his analysis as kind of fearless and unusual in this moment. The separate question is whether or not Ronan himself is the right target for that critique. And there, I think he missed on a number of different fronts. One part of it is just the confusion of the word resistance here, because yes, it's true that Ronan Farrow took on the biggest villain of our era, which is Harvey Weinstein, but he was not the biggest villain of our era. When he launched his investigation, he was a lionized figure in the resistance. There wasn't really a resistance yet, but in the Democratic Party, he was a towering figure. He also took down Les Moonves at CBS. He took down Eric Schneiderman, very liberal attorney general from New York. So it's not as if he was only picking targets that people in liberal circles were happy to see go down. And in fact, one of the mistakes that Ben does bust Ronan for making is with Hillary Clinton, and that does seem to be pretty clear cut the way that Ben lays it out. Ronan had reported that Hillary pushed off doing an interview with him when she found out that he was reporting critically about Harvey Weinstein. It appears that what in fact happened is that Hillary Clinton's spokesperson, Nick Merrill, was trying to figure out from Ronan whether or not he had the goods on Harvey Weinstein. And if he did, then the Clintons were going to pull out of a documentary that they were doing with Weinstein, because they didn't want to be, caught up with a sex predator and a criminal who's getting exposed in public by Ronan Farrow at the same time that they're rolling out a documentary. So in that discrete sense, Farrow doesn't exactly fit the model of what you would think of as a resistance journalist. The other quibbles that I would have with the piece is that Ben says that Ronan Farrow's kind of central conspiracy in the subtitle of his book is that the Harvey Weinstein worked with the National Enquirer to use dirt on Matt Lauer and Andy Lack to blackmail NBC into not publishing the Harvey Weinstein information. But I didn't read his. First of all, it's a great read. Everybody should read the book, whether you buy Ben's criticisms or not. It's a terrific book. But I didn't read that conspiracy as referring specifically to that suggestion, but more broadly to the way that Weinstein used espionage, political power, and his relationships with powerful people in order to suppress coverage about him. And he did it very effectively. And Ronan does have reporting that suggests that some types of leverage were used against NBC. He has a phone call where Weinstein says to Andy Lack, "Look, you're going to come at me for this. It was the 90s. We all did it, Andy." And he repeats, "We all did it, Andy." Now, okay, all he said is that we all did it. But Andy Lack knows what he did in the 1990s. He knows that Harvey Weinstein knows what he did in the 1990s. And so, you're never really going to find a case of blackmail that's written down on paper that says if you do, XYZ, I'm going to expose this particular thing that I know that you did.
Yeah, I think these are both. Yeah, I think this is important in order to both to parse the details, but to frame it in the broader conversation. Within the broader conversation around resistance journalism, Ryan, I also agree with you. That is where I think the best point of Ben's column kind of comes through. How do you assess that in terms of so much of the journalism around Trump and in the Trump age and what it's done to the craft? Because you responded to criticism, I think, of people who said, Ryan, why are you spending all this time reporting on Tara Reade? And one of the points that you made, which I thought was great, was, hey, I don't know what impact it's going to have. Maybe I did Biden a favor because I put it out now and not in October, whenever it would have been later. So how do you think that broadly the erosion of standards and of thinking about journalism in that way has done to the craft overall?
Like a significant part of it is when the New York Times got rid of its public editor, they said, we're going to allow the people to be our public editor. And the people are going to speak, essentially through twitter.com. And you're now seeing the effect of that. Reporters and editors can tell each other that they don't pay attention to what they're seeing on social media, but they're lying to each other and to themselves. And so by making Twitter the kind of public editor, that if your piece is let's say it's on Russiagate, is being lapped up by social media, and people are taking dots that you've put out and connecting them even further, then that is what you've said is your public editor. That's your public editor now declaring that you're doing great work. And so and that just has a kind of self-reinforcing kind of cycle to it, where then it winds up on cable news, and then it comes back into the paper and back into cable news. When we had the Mueller investigation going on, a lot of the journalistic protocols were thrown out the window because you can just say Mueller is looking into X. Now without Mueller, it's a lot harder to kind of write those stories. Right. But if you were trying to write a story about a Russian oligarch's influence on X, and you couldn't nail the story down, before Mueller, well, too bad. That would have been a great juicy story, but we're going to have to move on because we don't have the goods on that. We don't know if it's true. We have a couple of dots. Could be a million explanations for it. We can't connect them, next. Right. Now, if you can get one person close to Mueller saying that, yeah, that's interesting, Then all of a sudden you have a story, Mueller investigating it. And your story is true because all you're saying is that Mueller is looking into this thing.
Right.
You're not saying that the thing is actually true. And the people close to Mueller, have their own incentives to see those stories generated. So they're willing to, effectively say that they're looking at whatever.
Right.
And so, it's true
That's
that it was kind of anything goes for a long time, and that produced in people this willingness to believe conspiracy theories, which is also you can't separate it from the kind of socio-political factors. Conspiracy theories thrive when people feel they have no control over their destiny or over their politics. Like the Middle East, under the autocratic rulers there is a place where conspiracy theories completely thrive. Israel is behind every bad thing that happens in a lot of those countries, for instance, and Israel is behind some of them, but not 100% of them. In the late 19th century, that's when conspiracy theories really took off in the United States, and that was the Gilded Age. That's when there was very little difference between the two parties. They were swapping the White House every 4 years, and these American oligarchs were just getting richer and richer and richer. And so people look for more fantastical explanations about what is happening to them. And so it's not surprising that after Trump shocks liberals by winning the White House in 2016, that in 2017 and on, they're searching for every possible explanation for how they got into this powerless situation. And unfortunately, a lot of journalistic institutions were willing to feed in.
I think that's really well said.
I think that's really well said. And on the flip side, too, it's not just that they're willing to feed into those theories, but on the other side, if something is inconvenient, like the story of Ben's was about Ronan Farrow and resistance journalism, then the same sort of press has nefarious motives, anti-press tactics that we recognize as problematic when they're coming from Donald Trump seem to bubble up on the left as well, which is a great point that you made on Twitter as well. Ryan Grim, thank you so much. Great to have you as always.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, thanks, guys.
Next on Rising, The View co-host Meghan McCain says former President Obama is responsible for his successor's election. Our thoughts on that when Rising continues.